Forge Gang! I am still a hard man. Let's go! This is Imperator of Forge. This is the Imperator of Forge channel. And this is Forge Gang Radio. Forge Gang Radio. And I'm coming at you live at the Forge Kino Smelter. Smush, 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 smelted. And today I will talk about life in a far outpost on the edge of the known world. A former Celtic island by the name of Britain, Britannia, as it would be known to the Romans, and later to the medieval Welsh, and even to some of the Anglo-Saxons. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. This is only about life in Roman Britain, which is kind of a continuation of my stuff that I did on life in ancient Rome and life in Celtic times, ancient Celtic times to be exact. So this will cover about a 400-year period from the early 1st century to the beginning of the 5th century. Good evening, interdimensional lizard. How are you doing this evening? You are always the first one to start watching. Welcome to another history podcast. I will try to not make this too long. If it goes on a little bit too long, I might break this into 2 parts. So here we go. Now, before I get started, I just know that someone is going to bring up that infamous BBC episode about a black African centurion who was stationed on Hadrian's Wall in Roman York, Roman Iberorium, or what is now York, which actually, ironically, got its name from Yarvik, from the Viking period of York. But anyways, if anybody wishes to inquire about the Black Centurion in that BBC episode, do let me know. But I will be kind of busy going over this history lesson, so here we go. It's been a little while. I've been kind of going a bit slow with this, so I'll start sharing my screen. And we'll go ahead and get into this. So let's see here. First, we have timeline of the Romans in Britain, about 55 BC to 410 AD, generally speaking. So we'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and go into a brief timeline of the presence of the Romans. So, timeline of Roman Britain from Julius Caesar's first landing on the shoreline of England, although it was not known as England in 55 BC, to famous, or perhaps rather the infamous, look to their own defense's letter of 410 AD. It's actually known as the Groans of the Britons, but it was a letter to the Romans. The Romans played an important part in British history for well over 400 years. And much of the landscape of modern England and Wales, and even some parts of Scotland, are still strongly influenced by the presence of the Romans. So this is Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain. From 55 BC, Julius Caesar leads the first Roman military expedition from Gaul to Britain, although his visit did not lead to conquest. 54 BC, Julius Caesar's second expedition. Again, the invasion did not lead to conquest. The Romans were primarily at this stage only interested in plunder and loot, and not actual conquest. Another reason why they crossed the channel was because some of the Gauls were crossing the channel and asking for aid, material and military aid from the Britons to fight the Romans in Gaul, and Britain fortifications in Gaul or something, and that was one of the reasons why. Apparently, Julius Caesar led an expedition. It's very interesting. I find it very interesting that Julius Caesar went to Britain, went and landed twice in Britain. And Claudius also led a successful invasion. But Napoleon and Hitler were never able to make such a conquest of Britain. So anyways, Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain, 27 BC. Augustus becomes the first Roman emperor. AD 43, the Roman Emperor Claudius orders 4 legions to conquer Britain. Once again from Gaul. August 43 AD, the Romans captured the capital of the Catuvellauni tribe, now Colchester, Essex. June of the same year, the Romans captured the hill forts of Dorset, including Maiden Castle. 48, the Romans have now conquered all territory between the Humber estuary and the Severn estuary. Parts that remain under British control include Domnamni, Cornwall in Devon, Wales and northwest of England. 47, the Romans forced their allies, the Iceni tribe of East Anglia, to relinquish all their weapons. The Iceni is short, or Colonia, at Colchester, for retired soldiers. This was the first civilian center of Roman Britain, and for a time the capital of the territory. 51 AD, the leader of the exiled Catuvellauni tribe, Caraticus, is captured. He had led a protracted guerrilla war against the occupying Roman forces for years, but was eventually brought to battle by the Roman governor Publius Ostorius. Caraticus spent the remainder of his days in retirement in Italy. 60. The Romans attacked the Druid stronghold in Anglesey. The campaign to occupy Wales was, however, cut short by the Iceni revolt in southeast England. 61 AD, after attempting to fully annex East Anglia, Boudicca leads a rebellion of the Iceni against the Romans. After burning down Colchester, London, and St. Albans, Boudicca was eventually defeated at the Battle of Walting Street. So this is Boudicca, or Boudicca, leading the Iceni. Building of the palace at Fishbourne commences. 80. London had grown to the point where it now houses a forum, basilica, governor's palace, and even an amphitheater. And this is the remains of Londinium's Roman basilica. 84. The Romans engaged the Caledonians at Mons Grappus is uncertain. It is thought that it took place somewhere in modern-day Aberdeenshire. 100 AD. Most of the 8 1,000 miles of Roman roads in Britain are completed, probably well before this date even, allowing troops and goods to travel easily across the country. The new Roman Emperor Trajan also orders a complete withdrawal from Scotland and the construction of a new frontier between Newcastle on Tyne and Carlisle. 122, to strengthen the border between Roman occupied Britain and Scotland, Emperor Hadrian orders the construction of a wall. Interestingly, many of the early forts along Hadrian's wall face south into Brigantian territory, showing the ongoing threat posed by recently subverted tribes of northern England. This is the remains of Hadrian's Wall today, 139-40. The Antonine Wall in Scotland, Caledonia, is built, dramatically shifting the northern border of Roman-occupied Britain. This new wall is built of earth and timber, and is strengthened by a series of forts along its length. Also, later during the Middle Ages, a lot of castles and built from the remains of Hadrian's Wall. So a lot of medieval castles are built from material from Hadrian's Wall, and the Antonine Wall as well, although the Antonine Wall was more like the Limes Germanicus. It was more made of wood than stone. This new wall is built of, and strengthened by a series of forts along its length. 150. Villas start appearing across the British countryside. Compared to their southern counterparts, they are fairly modest, however, with fewer than 10 having mosaic floors. So they're actually very simple compared to the ones in Italy and the Balkans. 155, St. Albans in Hertfordshire, one of the largest towns in Roman Britain, is destroyed by fire. 163, the order is given to abandon the Antonine Wall, and for Roman troops to withdraw back to Hadrian's Wall. Although the reasons for this are unclear, it is thought that an uprising by the Brigantes had forced the retreat. 182, the Brigantes, along with other tribes of southern Scotland and northern England, start revolting against the Romans. Fighting continued for years along Hadrian's Wall, with towns further south building preventative defenses should the rioting spread. 197, after a period of infighting within Rome, a series of military commissioners arrive in Britain looking to purge any supporters of the recently ousted usurper, Decimus Claudius. They also look to rebuilding Hadrian. They also look at rebuilding Hadrian's Wall over the next 15 years. They also look at rebuilding Hadrian's Wall after over 15 years of clashes with the northern barbarian tribes. 209, after years of protracted conflict with the northern tribes, the Romans lead an army to Hadrian's Wall border to engage the Caledonians. With the Romans aiming to meet the rebels in pitched battle, the Caledonians instead opt for guerrilla warfare. This forces peace treaties to be signed between the belligerents. 211, Britain is divided up into two separate provinces. The south was to be called Britannia Superior, superior being in reference to the fact that it was closer to Rome, with the north being named Britannia Inferior. London was the new capital of the south, with York the capital of the north. AD 250 onwards, new threats to Roman Britannia emerge as the Picts from Scotland, as well as the Angles Saxons and Utes from Germany and Scandinavia start threatening Roman lands. A series of Saxon shore forts are constructed along the eastern and southern coasts of England as well as northern France for protection. 255, with the increasing threat from seaborne Germanic tribes, London's city wall is completed with the final stretch along the north bank of the Thames. A portion of London's Roman city wall, as it now appears today, again, a lot of medieval turrets, cathedrals, and castles were built from this material. 259, Britain, Gaul, and Spain split away from the Roman Empire, creating the so-called Gallic Empire. 274, the Gallic Empire is reabsorbed into the main Roman Empire. 287, the admiral of the Roman Channel Fleet, Caraccius, declares himself the Emperor of Britain and Northern Gaul and starts minting his own coins. This person is in fact the first ruler of Britain and Northern France to have his own minted coinage. 293, Caraccius is assassinated by his treasurer Electus, who quickly starts work on his palace in London to solidify his claim to authority. He also starts building the famous Saxon shore forts along the coast of Britain, both to strengthen defenses against the Germanic tribes to the east, but also to prevent Rome from sending a fleet to recover Britain for the empire. 296. The Roman Empire recaptures Britannia, and Electus is killed in battle near Silchester in Hampshire. Britain is then split up into 4 provinces: Maxima, Caesariensis, northern England up to Hadrian's Wall; Britannia Prima, the south of England; Flavia Caesarensis, the Midlands in East Anglia; and Britannia Secunda, Wales. 313. Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire. 343. Probably in response to a military emergency, although no one is quite sure what this emergency was in relation to, Emperor Constans makes a visit to Britain. 367. Barbarians from Scotland, Ireland, and Germany coordinate their attacks and launch raids on Roman Britain. Many towns are plundered throughout the province, and Britain falls into a state of anarchy. 369. A large force from Rome, led by military commander Theodosius, arrives in Britain and drives back the barbarians. 396. Large-scale barbarian attacks on Britain start again. Large naval engagements are ordered against the invaders, with reinforcements arriving from other areas of the empire. This is probably where a lot of foreigners from across the entire Roman Empire, which is already starting to fragment apart, probably arrive and are stationed in Britain. 399. Peace is fully restored throughout Roman Britannia. 401. A large amount of troops are withdrawn from Britain to assist with the war against Alaric I, who attempted to sack Rome. 406. For the past 5 years, Roman Britannia had suffered frequent breaches of its borders by barbarian forces. With the Roman Empire focused on the more serious threats to Italy, reinforcements have stopped and Britain is left to its own devices. 407. The remaining Roman garrisons in Britain proclaim one of their own generals, Constantine III, Emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Constantine quickly pulls together a force and crosses the English Channel to invade Gaul, leaving Britain with only a skeleton force to defend itself. It is quite possible that Vortigern was among that skeleton force that stayed behind. 409 AD, after throwing off their allegiance to Constantine III in 408, the local British populace expelled the final remnants of Roman authority in 409. 410, with increased incursions from the Saxons, Scots, Picts, and Angles, Britain turns to the Roman Emperor Honorius for help. He writes back telling them to look to their own defenses, the groans of the Britons, and refuses to send any help. This letter is considered by many to be the end of Roman Britain. All right, so what was life in Roman Britain like overall? What was the general life and characteristics of this far off, rather backward, half buttressed province of a Mediterranean empire? Roman Britain, villas, baths, and daily life. The Roman occupation unquestionably had an effect on Britain, but it is easy to overstate how widespread the effect was. Although the form of life changed for some people, the essence of Britain's Celtic society was actually altered very little. Why, you ask? Let's have a look. Caroburf Temple of Methras, or Methras in Northumberland. Administration. One of the first things the Romans did was to involve the conquered tribes in the administration of the province. They did this in Dacia and Gaul as well. They set up administrative centers according to traditional tribal territories and involved the tribal aristocracies in the decision-making process. This was standard Roman practice, and a wise one. They made the conquered people responsible for their own administration within a Roman Mediterranean framework. It was part of their plan to bring the benefits of civilization, Roman style, to other peoples. It worked, for the way to prestige and social advancement was through the Roman bureaucracy. And that's actually one of the negative things about the Roman Empire and its legacy. It left a gigantic bureaucracy and a lot of divination and deification of rulers, and probably a lot of the reasons for the later European authoritarianism had a lot to do with this kind of Roman bureaucracy, with its legacy in the 20th century and in the Napoleonic French Empire. That is to say, Napoleon's empire. Napoleon modeled a lot of his state on the Roman Empire. Towns. What did the Romans do in Britain? Well, for a start, they encouraged the growth of towns. The Romans saw urban life as the epitome of sophisticated civilization. They encouraged the growth of towns near their army bases and established special towns as settlements for retired soldiers. They encouraged the ruling class of Celtic aristocrats to build town dwellings, and they made the town centers of very vibrant commercial activity. As elsewhere in the far-flung empire, the local councils in the towns were encouraged to build civic buildings as a mark of prestige and civilization. There was no standard plan to adhere to, so there was a great deal of local variation in the way that the towns interpreted the Roman ideal. The Romans built towns in lowland areas, such as at fords across rivers, in contrast to the earlier Neolithic and Iron Age practice of sticking to the slopes and higher ground above the valleys. Town boundaries, unlike military forts, were not laid out in rigid rectangles or squares, but they did contain a regular grid-like network of streets. Most towns were walled, though at first the walls would have been no more than earthen banks with ditches. By the third and certainly the fourth century, the earthen banks were replaced by stone and masonry. The center of a Roman town was a forum, or civic center, usually an open square or rectangle with colonnades. The forum gave access to the basilica or town hall. It was here that the courts of justice were held, though it could also be used as a merchant's assembly. Town life was a real social revolution for the largely rural Celtic society. Those who aspired to the wealth and prosperity that came with the Roman occupation threw themselves into life in the towns. Public baths. So this is Wroxeter Roman town in Shropshire. Public baths. Every town had public baths. The baths were a Roman institution, and most town dwellers would have attended daily before their evening meal. They were open to both sexes. So if you're wondering about the origins of British homosexuality and British sodomy, well, it was probably here. This might very well be the origins of the infamous British sodomy. Anyways, they were open to both sexes, though at different times of day, and served as a combination of a health club, a healing spa, and a meeting place. The order that people went through the baths seems to have been up to the individual, though they were generally arranged in the order of exercise area, disrobing area, cold, warm, and hot rooms. Some baths further divided up the hot rooms into steam and dry heat areas. Public entertainment. Many towns also offered the entertainments of the theater and amphitheater. The theater, an open-air, tiered clamshell, would have offered fare from classical plays, pantomime, and religious festivals. The amphitheater, an open-air oval, would have appealed to a less discriminating taste, offering gladiatorial combats, contests between men and animals, and public executions. The number of theaters and amphitheaters in Britain is small, so these particular entertainments may not have been so popular. Roman roads. Joining the towns together were the Roman roads. Over the course of the occupation, the Romans built over 9,600 kilometers of roads in Britain. Although contrary to reputation, they weren't always straight. They were amazingly well built and made troop movement and later the movement of commercial goods much easier. The imperial posting service, used by Roman officials, maintained inns and relays of horses at intervals of 30 to 50 kilometers along the roads. The roads were literally highways, raised up to the cambered bank of material dug from roadside ditches. They were constructed in several layers, the final layer generally being gravel or flint, and reached from 4 to 8 meters wide. Villas. Aside from the towns, the other sign of Romanized Latin civilization was the growth of villas. In Latin, the word villa simply means farm. So technically, villas were any form of rural agricultural dwelling built in a Roman style. In practice, though, when we speak of villas, we mean the country estates of the Romanized British elite. Although at first the conquered tribal aristocracy may have been drawn into towns, it wasn't long before they began a back to the land movement. Most large villas were built quite close to major urban centers, generally within 10 miles, so the owners were never very far from the center of affairs. Villas were far more than fancy houses, though. They were centers of rural industry and agriculture. In one complex, they could hold the landowner and his family, overseers, laborers, storehouses, and industrial buildings. Although some may have been strictly the center of large farms, others included industry in the form of pottery and metalworking. Individual houses were as different then as they are now, but the villas followed some general patterns. They were half timber frame houses on stone foundations, 1 story in height, capped with slate or clay tiled roofs. Underfloor heating systems were universal, though in one intriguing case the system was never fired up. Tile floors were common, and most larger villas contained at least one room with a mosaic floor. Walls may have been decorated with mosaics or painted scenes. Furniture was made of wood, in patterns similar to Roman style throughout the empire. Many villas also had separate bathhouses. The golden age of the villa in Britain was in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. After that, they fell into disuse or were taken over for other purposes. Trade. Industry in various forms was encouraged by the Romans. In their bid for the veneer of civilization, the elite of Britain imported Roman wine, jewelry, and pottery. In return, they exported cattle, grain, lead, iron, tin, and curiously enough, hunting dogs. The local pottery industries throughout Britain flourished, as did ironworking. The large standing Roman army in Britain, as many as 40,000 troops for long periods of time, was a natural market energizer for British industry, and the extensive Roman road network helped speed the transport of goods throughout the island. The observant reader, this means you, will have noticed that most of the talk so far has been about how the upper classes lived. Certainly, most of the remains that have been excavated and analyzed pertain to them. How did the rest of the British Celts manage? Probably with a great shrug. Despite the growth of towns and bureaucracy and all the other essentials of civilization that came with the Roman conquest, the lot of the majority was unchanged. Britain was an agricultural province, dependent on small farms. The lives of the farmers changed very little. They still built round Celtic huts and worked the same fields in the same way. Their standard of living changed little, if at all, despite the veneer of Roman civilization. Britain was still largely a Celtic or even a Neolithic society at best. So Roman Britain was not as sophisticated and developed as Asia Minor, Greece, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Italy, and southern France and Spain. It was very half-heartedly done. Chauncey Fatsack Oh, what's up, Chauncey? I've been really going hard on Sober-chan. I've got quite a lot to tell you about Sober-chan. Chauncey Fatsack says bread and circus. Pretty much. Typical bureaucratic system. All right, so this is localhistories.org, Life in Roman Britain by Tim Lambert. Towns in Roman Britain. After the 1st century AD, the Celts, who lived in what is now England and Wales, to a certain extent Romanized. Many towns appeared. Some were created deliberately. Others grew up by Roman forts as the garrisons provided markets for the townspeople's goods. Roman towns were usually laid out in a grid pattern. Streets were often covered in gravel. When people walked on the gravel, it became compacted. Very often, streets had drains at the sides. At first, towns in Roman Britain were unprotected. Then, in the late 1st and 2nd centuries, fortifications were built. They consisted at first of ditches with earth ramparts and wooden palisades. Later, many towns had stone walls. In the center of Roman towns was a rectangular space called the Forum. It was lined by shops and by a public building called the Basilica. Markets were also held on the Forum. In the towns, another important building was the public baths. In Roman times, people went to the baths not just to get clean, but also to sodomize. Socialize. Roman baths consisted of a frigidarium, or cold room, a tepidarium, or warm room, and a caldarium, or hot room. A caldarium, or hot room. They usually finished with a dip in a cold pool. To clean themselves, Romans rubbed their skin with olive oil or oil and scraped it off with a tool called a strigil. Roman baths in Bath. Larger towns also had an amphitheater where cruel sports such as cockfighting were held, and sometimes gladiators fought to the death. Some Roman towns also had theaters. The Romans gambled with dice. They also played board games. Roman children played with wooden or clay dolls. They also played ball games. In the late 1st and 2nd centuries, the Romans practiced cremation. However, in the 3rd century, they began to bury the dead. Citizens were buried in cemeteries outside the walls. Many Roman towns also had public toilets. Towns in Roman Britain were small by our standards. It is not known exactly how big they were, but London may have had a population of around 35,000. Towns like Colchester and Cirencester probably had between 10,000 and 12,000 inhabitants. Most towns were smaller with only 3,000 to 5,000 people. Roman Britain was, of course, an agricultural society where most people made their living from farming. Although there were many craftsmen, only a small minority of the population, probably around 10%, lived in towns, if even that. Life for the rich in Roman Britain. Meanwhile, upper-class Celts adopted the Roman way of life. They built villas modeled on Roman buildings, and they enjoyed luxuries such as mosaics and even a form of central heating called a hypocast. In a hypocast, the floor was raised above the ground on pillars. A fire was lit in a furnace and the hot air circulated under the floor. It also rose through spaces in the walls. Smoke rose through spaces in walls, then escaped through flues in the roof. Of course, a hypocast was expensive. It burned large amounts of wood, and you needed slaves to keep loading fuel into the furnace. Only the rich could afford them. Wealthy Romans also had wall paintings called murals in their houses. In their windows they had pines of glass. In their windows they had pines of glass. Of course, poorer Romans had none of these things. Their houses were simple and plain, and the main form of heating was braziers. For the wealthy, furniture was very comfortable. It was upholstered and finely carved. People ate while reclining on couches. Oil lamps were used for light. Furthermore, some people had a piped water supply. Water was brought into towns in aqueducts and along lead pipes to individual houses. The sons and daughters of better off Romans went to primary school to learn to read and write and do simple arithmetic. Usually only boys went to secondary school, where they would learn geometry, history, literature, and oratory, the art of public speaking. Girls and boys from rich families were educated at home by a tutor. Roman boys and girls wore a kind of necklace called a bulla, a bola. It consisted of a charm inside a pouch. It was worn around the neck. A boy wore his until he reached manhood. A girl discarded hers when she got married. For rich children, the bulla was made of gold. Jewelry in general was also more likely to be made from gold or something else just as rare. For the rich in Roman Britain, luxuries like wine and olive oil were imported. Food in Roman Britain. The Romans also introduced new foods into Britain. Among them were celery, cabbages, radishes, cucumbers, broad beans, and walnuts. Romans also cooked on Romans cooked on charcoal stoves. Olive oil was imported. So were olives, figs, and grapes. Wine was also imported, although the Romans attempted to grow vines in Britain. The Romans were also very fond of fish sauce called liquamen. They also liked oysters, which were exported from Britain. A Roman dining room was called a triclinium. Triclinium. The Romans ate a breakfast of bread and fruit called the ientaculum. At midday they ate a meal called the prandium of fish, cold meat, bread, and vegetables. The main meal was called the cena or the cena and was eaten in the evening. And this is olives. Transport in Roman Britain. The Romans are also famous for the network of roads they built across Britain, which remained centuries after they departed. Rich people traveled by horse or on long journeys by covered wagon. Sometimes they were carried in litters, seats between two long poles. Transport by water was also important to the Romans. They built large merchant ships called cortia, which could carry up to 1,000 tons of cargo. Roman ships had a single main mast, which carried a rectangular sail, although some ships also had small sails at the bow and stern. Roman ships did not have rudders. Instead, they were steered by oars. The Romans also built lighthouses to aid shipping. Poor people in Roman Britain. However, Roman rule probably made little difference to most poor Celts, especially in the north and extreme southwest of England. For them, life went on much as it had before in the Iron Age. Their houses remained simple huts. Like the Celts before them and the Saxons after them, the Romans kept slaves. A slave was simply a piece of property and could be bought and sold like an animal. Most people probably treated their slaves reasonably well, simply to keep them working efficiently. However, no doubt some masters were cruel. Probably slaves who worked in mines were the worst off. However, some slaves managed to gain their freedom or were given their freedom by their masters. Soldiers in Roman Britain. In the 1st century AD, a Roman legionary wore segmented armor, lorica segmentata. He threw a spear called a pilum, and fought with a short sword called a gladius. He was protected by a curved rectangular shield. There were also auxiliary soldiers, both infantry and cavalry. When they finished their service, they became Roman citizens. By the 3rd century, the cavalry had become much more important. The Roman army needed mobility to fight the Huns, the Ostrogoths, the Saxons, the Franks, and the Alans, who were making hit and run raids on the various different parts of the empire, or for fighting the Saxons who were making hit and run raids on Britain. The Romans built a line of forts along the Saxon shore from the Wash to Pevensey in Sussex to fight them. Roman religion. The Romans were usually tolerant of religion, but they destroyed the Druids. The Druids had great political and social influence. The Romans probably saw them as a threat. However, although the Druid priesthood was abolished, the Celtic people continued to worship their traditional pantheon of gods and goddesses. The Romans introduced their gods, but they were often very similar to the Celtic ones. They were so similar, temples were often dedicated to both the Celtic god and the Roman equivalent. The Romans also introduced religions from the East. By the 3rd century, Mithraism was popular. It involved the worship of the Persian god Mithras, the god of light and the sun. By the 2nd century, there were Christians in Roman Britain. The Romans persecuted Christians, but we only know the names of 3 Christian British martyrs. Saint Alban was martyred in a Roman town called Verulamium. Later in history, another town was built by it and named St. Albans. We also know the names of Aaron and Julius, but little else about them. The persecution of Christians ended in 312 when Constantine converted to the new faith. All right. And I will talk about the presence of foreigners and people of other races and ethnicities in Roman Britain in a moment. Also, this is where I got the thumbnail for this stream. All right, London's Roman Basilica and Forum. Originally built in AD 70, London's Roman Basilica was a building unlike any other. Originally built in AD 70 and then expanded in AD 90 to 120, London's Roman Basilica was a building unlike any other in Britain, occupying nearly 2 hectares of land and standing at a height of up to 3 stories high. This building was larger than the present-day St. Paul's Cathedral. The basilica acted as a civic center and housed city administrators, law courts, an assembly hall, the treasury, and shrines. At its height, it was also the largest building of its type north of the Alps, showing the importance of London within the Roman Empire. A reconstruction of the Basilica and Forum with how it may have looked after AD 120. The Basilica also formed one side of a forum, a huge open-air square that acted as a public meeting place, similar to modern-day Trafalgar Square, and housed many shops and market stalls. The Forum was also a popular place for socializing and partying in Roman-era London. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, numerous structural faults were identified with the buildings, and a series of repairs and modifications were carried out. However, the nail in the coffin didn't come until AD 300, when both the Basilica and Forum were destroyed by Rome as a punishment for London supporting the rogue emperor Caraccius. Although small portions of the Forum may have survived, the majority of the Basilica and Forum were lost into the annals of history until the construction of Leadenhall Market in the 1880s. During this building work, a large support was found which would have acted as the base of an arch in one of the basilica's arcades. Today, these remains are housed in the basement of a barber shop at the corner of Gracechurch Street and Loudonhall Market. We have marked the location on a Google map at the end of this article. The barber shop at the corner of Gracechurch Street and Leadenhall Market. The remains of one of the basilica's arches, situated in the basement of the barber shop. During construction work in 1987, a set of the Forum's remains were found at 21 Lime Street, around 100 yards south of the remains at the barber shop in Loudonhall Market. Excavations by the museum in London in both 1990 and 2001 revealed Roman remains dating as far back as the Boudiccan fire of AD 60, as well as structural remains of the east wing of the Forum itself, including parts of the floor. The 21 Lime Street site. Unfortunately, 21 Lime Street is not open to the public as the site is being prepared for construction of a small skyscraper. However, if you're quick and don't mind perching over the hoardings, you can still see the site where the excavations took place. And this is just how to get to this place. This doesn't really pertain to the subject of the stream, so I will not read through that. And then, what was life like on Hadrian's Wall for the average Roman soldier? What was life like on Hadrian's Wall? In the 2nd century AD, the Emperor of Rome ordered the construction of a wall to secure the northernmost border of his empire. It was to be the greatest single building project ever seen in Europe, as Miles Russell reveals. All right, so it looks like you have to pay for this crap. So I'm not going to pay it, so we'll just skip. Let's see here. Have I gone a good hour or so of this? Yeah. All right, so there was a BBC episode about a black Roman soldier in Roman Britain. And so I'm guessing that a lot of people want to know about what was really going on with regards to this multicultural exchange in the Roman Empire, and particular in Roman Britain. So let's have a look. How free movement in the Roman Empire resulted in a multicultural Britain. Gary Shaw. After Britain became part of the Roman Empire in AD 43, the island and its inhabitants were integrated into the wider Roman world. This drastically increased the possibilities for migration to and from the newly minted province. Yet for the majority of Britons, little changed. Most chose to spend their lives in their local communities, remaining close to their place of birth, identifying with their clan or tribe. Some, however, immigrated from their homeland and traveled great distances across the Mediterranean, often as members of the Roman army. At the same time, people migrated to Britain from across the empire, although this usually happened as a result of military service. Many also arrived as traders and slaves. An interesting case is that of Beretus of Palmyra, a Syrian who traveled to Britain probably as a merchant. On arrival, he bought a slave named Regina, who had been born into the Catuvellauni tribe of southern Britain. Afterwards, Beretus freed Regina, and the two married. From the depiction of Regina on her tombstone, by the time of her death at 38, she had become quite wealthy. Beretus himself lived to be 68, dying at Carbridge near Newcastle. It is amazing to think that Beretus had left his home in the Levant to travel across the empire, married a Briton, and ended his life in northern England. Even Regina, while not traveling as far, had moved from southern Britain to the northern edge of the Roman world. As a Roman province, Britain became a diverse, multicultural society. This has long been known from the textual sources and material remains. But now scientific analysis are also enhancing our knowledge of migration to the island. One recent study in particular, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, used scientific techniques to shed light on the origins of some of London's earliest inhabitants. The researchers applied lead and strontium isotope analysis to the dental enamel of 20 people buried in the ancient settlement between the 1st and 5th centuries AD, the first large-scale study of its kind for Roman Britain. They revealed that 12 of the individuals probably grew up around Londinium, while another 4 probably grew up elsewhere. The results for the remaining 4 were inconclusive. Intriguingly, although one woman buried with Germanic items was shown to be non-local, as one might expect, a man from the same burial ground, also interred with Germanic items, was shown to be from Londinium rather than abroad. From his burial alone, he might have been regarded as an immigrant, but the scientific data suggests otherwise. Of the 3 remaining migrants identified, one, thought to be only 8 years old at death, appears to have come from near the Rhine Valley, despite being buried with typically British grave goods. The others were traced to the Mediterranean region, with one perhaps from Rome. This all adds to the increasing data derived from scientific analysis about migration to Britain in Roman times. It seems that most major Roman towns included large foreign populations, men, women, and children, who brought their own cultural traditions, intermarried with the local population, and over time acculturated. But what about British immigrants? Surprisingly, as discussed in a recent article in the journal Britannia, although there is increasing evidence for migration to Britain during the Roman Empire, it's rare to find written evidence for British immigrants. In fact, only around 40 examples are known. They lived across the Mediterranean world, from Bordeaux, Rome, and Solin in Croatia to Lambaesis in Algeria. Some were quite important, such as Marcus Minicius Marcellinus, a senior centurion originally from Lincoln and stationed in Mainz. The number of British immigrants, however, was certainly much higher than the evidence allows us to see, for many would not have left inscribed monuments for us to find. The authors of the Britannia study also highlight an intriguing case of a Briton living abroad, a centurion named Titus Quintius Petrullus, who, after the above-mentioned Marcus Minicius Marcellinus, is only the second known centurion of British birth, although there are a few other potential possibilities. The only evidence for Petrullus' life is written on his tombstone, discovered in Bostra, Syria, and dated to the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. This relates that Petrullus was a centurion of Legio III Cyrenica and died at the age of 30. What else can we say about this man's life? The study's authors argue that his cognomen Petrullus suggests a Celtic background, and because he was relatively young for a centurion, he was probably directly commissioned, as opposed to having risen up the ranks. For a man to be directly commissioned, he would normally have held municipal offices first, suggesting that Petrullus was someone of high importance, perhaps a member of the local British elite. Through such studies, the extent of migration into the Roman world is becoming clearer. More than just a chance for sightseeing, holidays around the empire were certainly enjoyed by the Roman elite. Travel could provide new opportunities, such as a better life in a distant land, migration, and the benefits of free movement. Though currently contentious topics are nothing new, just ask Beretus. Beretus. And I've got an interesting article that I just remembered reading about Egyptians in Roman Britain. Everybody knows about the Egyptian mummies in Egypt, particularly of the old, that they found mummies in Roman Britain of likely Egyptian origin. Someone was talking earlier about connections between the Egyptians and the Celts, or something like that. See if I can't find it. Okay, I'm not going to be able to read all of this stuff, and also this is under copyright. Okay, this is under copyright, so I'm not going to be able to use that. Alrighty, so what happened after the Romans withdrew from Britannia? What was going on in sub-Roman Britain, as the period is known? Because it was Anglo-Saxon or the early medieval period or something. But yeah. All right, so here we go. And this kind of falls in line when I'm going to be covering the end of antiquity and how classical antiquity transitioned into the Middle Ages and stuff. So consider this something of an but yeah, I want to give a satisfactory finish up for this. And I've been going for about an hour now, but there is so much to talk about what was going on back then. It was really something else. And Hadrian's Wall has been a landscape between England and Scotland for pretty much the last 2000, well, 1900 years, basically. The last 1800, 1900 years, this has completely shaped the English and the Scottish countryside. Hadrian's Wall, History and Stories. Hadrian's Wall is a rich and vibrant place. It was a border, but it was also a place where borders were crossed. Here, soldiers and civilians from across together at the northwestern frontier of the Roman Empire. Many settled in this wild foreign place across the sea and adopted local customs, worshipping native gods, even while preserving their own traditions. Peel back the layers of 400 years of Roman rule, etc., etc. So Hadrian's Wall was a complex let's see here. This might be under copyright. It doesn't say anything about copyright. So, anyways, when was Hadrian's Wall built? Permanent conquest of Britain began in AD 43. By about 100, the northernmost army units in Britain lay along the Tyne Solway Isthmus. The forts here were linked by a road known as the Staingate between Corbridge and Carlisle. Hadrian came to Britain in AD 122, and according to a biography written 200 years later, put many things to right, and was the first to build a wall 80 miles from the sea, 80 miles long from sea to sea, to separate the barbarians from the Romans. The building of Hadrian's Wall probably began that year, and took at least 6 years to complete. The original plan was for a wall of stone or turf, with a guarded gate every mile, and 2 observation towers in between, and fronted by a wide, deep ditch. Before work was completed, 14 forts were added, followed by an earthwork known as the Vallum to the south. The inscription of the Elampan, a 2nd century souvenir, Elampan, a 2nd century souvenir of Hadrian's Wall found in 2003, suggests that it was called the Vallum Aali, the Vallam Ali, alias being Hadrian's family name. So it was not actually called Hadrian's Wall. The turret at Willowsford is one of the best preserved on the whole of Hadrian's Wall. It was completed at least to this height before an early change of plan led the wall to be narrowed from 10 to 8 Roman feet. The first design. The wall was placed slightly north of the existing line of military installations between the River Tyne and the Solway Firth. Its line was carefully chosen to make best use of the topography, and it was surveyed from each and towards the middle, or rather towards the crags in sections. Building in the east started at the point where the road from the south, Dare Street, met the wall, and where later a gate, the Port Gate, was erected. As first planned, most of the wall was to be built in stone, but the eastern 30-mile section was in turf. In front of both was a substantial ditch, except where crags or rivers made this unnecessary. At each mile, a gate was protected by a small guard post called a mile castle. Between each pair of mile castles lay 2 towers, turrets, creating a pattern of observation points every third of a mile. The stone wall, with a maximum height of about 15 feet, 4.6 meters, was 10 Roman feet, 3 meters wide, was enough for there to have been a walkway along the top, and perhaps also a parapet wall. The turf sector was 20 Roman feet, 6 meters high. To the north of the turf sector lay 3 advanced forts, all probably part of this plan. But otherwise, the forts remained on the Stane Gate behind the wall. The remains of Castle Nick Mile Castle, which was probably built by the 6th Legion. A change of plan. Before the first plan was completed, a radical change led to the placing of forts on the wall line and down the Cumbrian coast, and the construction of an earthwork to the south. The forts, each apparently built for a single unit and at a basic placing of 7 1/3 miles, were placed astride the wall wherever possible. This allowed 3 main gates, each with 2 entrances made the equivalent of 6-mile castle gates, to provide access to the north. The double portal south gate was supplemented by 2 small side gates. The position of the forts and the provision of so many gates suggest that a requirement for increased mobility led to this change. The addition of the forts was followed by the construction of an earthwork to the south 120 Roman feet, an actus about 35 meters wide. This consisted of a central ditch between 2 mounds. Causeways surmounted by gates were provided at forts. The purpose of the vallum, as this earthwork is known, was presumably to protect the rear of the frontier zone. After the forts had been added, the width of the wall was narrowed to 8 Roman feet, 2.4 meters or less, and the standard of craftsmanship reduced, both presumably in order to speed work. Aerial view of the wall at Cafields, looking east, showing Cafields Mile Castle, the line of the vallum. The earthwork to the south of the wall can be seen in the background. Who built the wall? Hadrian's wall was built by the army of Britain, as many inscriptions demonstrate. The 3 legions of regular trained troops in Britain, each consisting of about 5,000 heavily armed infantrymen, provided the main body of men building the wall, but they were assisted by the auxiliary units, the other main branch of the provincial army, and even the British fleet. The complex building program took many years to complete. It is possible that it started before Hadrian's arrival in Britain in AD 122, and that the major change in plan was a result of his intervention. Housesteads, one of the forts placed on the line of the wall, has part of the revised plan for the frontier. Who manned the wall? Although mainly built by legionnaires, the wall was manned by auxiliaries. They were organized into regiments nominally either 500 or 1,000 strong, and either infantry or cavalry or both. The 500 strong mixed infantry and cavalry units was the workhorse of the frontier. Each fort on the wall appears to have been built to hold a single auxiliary unit. The troops based in the forts and mile castles of the wall were mostly recruited from the northwestern provinces of the Roman Empire, though some were from further afield. Army units tend to be accompanied as camp followers. Little is known about these people in the early years of the wall. It would appear that they were not allowed to settle in the zone between the wall and the vallum. Excavation has demonstrated the existence of civil settlements in the 3rd century, and geophysical survey has recorded the urban sprawl spreading well beyond the forts. These remains are undated, however. The boar emblem of the 20th Legion, one of the units which built and helped to man Hadrian's wall. The wall after Hadrian. Hadrian's death in AD 138 brought a new emperor to power. The emperor Antonius Pius abandon Hadrian's Wall and move the frontier up to the Fourth Clyde Isthmus, where he built a new wall, this time of turf, the Antonine Wall. This had a short life of about 20 years before being abandoned in favor of a return to Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall had been sighted when it was abandoned. Hadrian's Wall had been slighted when it was abandoned, with Mile-Castle gates removed and crossings thrown across the Vallum ditch. Now all was brought back into working order, though the work of reconstructing the Vallum was never finished. A road was also added to the frontier. Hadrian's Wall appears to have continued in this form into the late 2nd century. A major war took place shortly after 180, when the tribes crossed the wall which divided them from the Roman forts and killed a general and the troops he had with them. We know no details of the subsequent fighting, but it probably led to changes to the wall, including the abandonment of many turrets in the crags sector and the redeployment of the army. A reconstruction drawing from Carbridge, Roman town at its most extensive, in the early 3rd century AD. The town that developed around the military compound at Corbridge remained a vibrant urban center until it was abandoned early in the 5th century. We can see this most clearly in the early 3rd century. At this time, the cavalry units were grouped round the two main roads to the north at the Port Gate, on Derry Street and beside Stanwix by Carlisle, and along the roads to the south. North of the wall, there were now 4 advance forts, 2 on each side of the country. The eastern forts each held a 1,000-strong mixed regiment of infantry and cavalry, an irregular unit and scouts. In the late 2nd and early 3rd century, many Mile-Castles had their north gates narrowed so that they could only be used by pedestrian traffic, while the major repair to the wall itself took place. The forts on Hadrian's Wall had a long life of nearly 300 years. Many modifications took place to the barrack blocks, the headquarters buildings, and the commanders' houses in particular. Some forts became overcrowded with buildings, others required open spaces. So far as we can determine, all continued to the end of Roman Britain, that is, into the early 5th century. The latest coins found on Hadrian's Wall were minted in AD 403 to 406. A reconstruction of the late 2nd or early 3rd century barracks in Chester's Roman fort. The accommodation at Chester's was completely rebuilt for the 2nd Asturians, a cavalry unit originally raised in northern Spain, at this time the heyday of all the forts in northern Britain. After the Romans, with the abandonment of Britain by the central authorities, it is less clear what happened. At Burdoswald, a case has been made for life at the fort continuing, with the regimental commander perhaps turning into a local chieftain. In the years that followed, Hadrian's Wall became a quarry for the stone to build castles and churches, farms and houses along its line, until the conservation movement in the 18th and 19th centuries put a stop to that. It was only from the mid-19th century onwards that early archaeologists and historians such as John Clayton, John Hodgson, and John Collingwood Bruce began to study Hadrian's Wall in earnest and sought to protect its magnificent remains. Portrait of John Clayton of Chesters, 1792 to 1890. After inheriting the Chesters estate in 1843, Clayton steadily expanded his holdings along the wall. His workmen uncovered and rebuilt many miles of the frontier and excavated several buildings. And so that is a bit about what life was like on Hadrian's Wall. Now, what happened after the Romans left? What happened in the sub-Roman period? So this is the Roman Brexit, how life in Britain changed after the Romans' departure in 409 AD. What happens next? Destruction from the Course of Empire by Thomas Cole, 1836. Leaving a major political body is nothing new for mainland Britain. In 409 AD, more than 350 years after the Roman conquest of 43 AD, the island slipped from the control of the Roman Empire. Much like the present Brexit, the process of this secession and its practical impacts on Britain's population in the early years of the 5th century remain ill-defined. As with the UK and Brussels, Britain had always been a mixed blessing for Rome. In around 415, Saint Jerome called the island fertile in tyrants, meaning usurpers, and late Roman writers portrayed a succession of rebellions in Britain, usually instigated by the army, many of whom would have been born in the province. Around 407, the latest usurper, Constantine III, left Britain, taking the remaining elements of the army with him. The late Roman writer Zosimus then wrote that the pressure of barbarian invaders obliged the British to throw off Roman rule and live no longer subject to Roman laws, but as they themselves pleased. A phrase guaranteed to warm the heart of any Brexiter. This episode, around 409, seems to have been the end of Roman government in Britain. No Romans left behind the small number of soldiers who went to the continent to fight with Constantine III. Instead, the end of Roman Britain was, like the proposed present Brexit, a change in a relationship with a distant administration. But how did this change actually affect the people who lived in the island? And what were the consequences? Roman life disappearing. One of the remarkable things about the first decades of the 5th century was the apparent speed with which the things we associate with Roman life disappeared. The use of coins seems to have been an early casualty. Coins were always supplied by Rome to do the things that the Roman government cared about, such as pay the army. The latest coins to be sent to Britain in any number stopped in 402 AD. Coin use may have continued in places for some years after, using older coins, but there was no real attempt to introduce local copies or substitutes, as sometimes happened elsewhere. This suggests there was no demand for small change or faith in the value of base metal coinage. Industrial pottery manufacture, widespread in the 4th century, also vanished by about 420 AD, while villas, some of which had achieved a peak of grandeur in the 4th century, were abandoned as luxury residences. Towns had already undergone dramatic changes, with monumental public buildings often abandoned from the 3rd century onwards, but signs of urban life vanished almost entirely after about 420 AD. The forts of Hadrian's Wall, beset by what the 6th century writer Gildas termed loathsome hordes of Scots and Picts, seemingly turned from Roman garrisons into bases of local leaders and militias. So basically, 5th century Mad Max. A hoard of Roman coins buried in about 365 AD in Somerset. Many archaeologists have argued that the change was more drawn out and less dramatic than I have described. Equally, our own views of what is and isn't Roman may not coincide with those held by people living during the 5th century. The notion of what was Roman was as complicated as Britishness is today. It's also clear that many aspects of Mediterranean Roman life, such as towns and monumental building, never really took off in Britain to the extent that they did elsewhere in the empire. And much of what we consider to be Roman never saw much enthusiasm across large parts of Britain. Nevertheless, we can be fairly certain that people quickly lost interest in things like coins, mosaics, villas, towns, and tableware. Vacated Hadrian's Wall. What came next? Although external forces such as barbarian invasion are often blamed for the end of Roman Britain, part of the answer may lie in changes to the way that people living in Britain viewed themselves. During the 5th century, once Britain was no longer part of the Roman Empire, new forms of dress, buildings, pottery, and burial rapidly appeared, particularly in the east of Britain. This may be partly associated with the coming of the Germanic immigrants from across the North Sea, whose impacts are so bemoaned by writers such as Gildas. However, the change was so widespread that the existing population must also have adopted such novelties as well. So it wasn't simply a change because of immigrants from Germania or from the barbarian parts of Europe, any more so as it was just Germanic items and Germanic culture that was adopted by the local population. There is a bit of integration as well. So the change was so widespread. However, the change was so widespread that the existing population must also have adopted such novelties as well. Paradoxically, in Western Britain, Cornwall, Wales, and the bit of southwest Scotland, at places like Tintagel, people who had never shown much interest in Mediterranean life began in the 5th and 6th centuries to behave in ways that were more Roman, even perhaps Byzantine. They used inscriptions on stone and imported wine, tablewares, and presumably perishable goods like silk from the eastern Mediterranean. For these people, being Roman, perhaps associated with Christianity, assumed a new importance, has a way of expressing their difference from those in the East who they associated with Germanic incomers. Archaeology suggests that late Roman Britain and sub-Roman Britain saw the same challenges to personnel and group to personal saw the same challenges to personal and group identities that the current Brexit debate stares today. There can surely be little doubt of that. Had they lived in the 5th century, those who now identify as leavers and remainers would have debated the impact of foreign immigration and the merits of staying in the Roman Empire with equal passion. We must hope that some of the more dramatic changes of the 5th century, such as the disappearance of urban life and a monetary economy, do not find their 21st century equivalents. This was written by Beth Daly, and this is on theconversation.org. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll talk a little bit about something known as Brythonic Romance or Brythonic Latin, also known as Insular Latin. This was influenced by the vulgar Latin of the foreign veteran soldiers and the slaves and other people that came into Britain in the 1st century and 2nd century and influenced quite a significant portion of the population into speaking Latin. Even after the Romans left, many Christian missionaries and people such as Irish and Scottish monks at Iona Monastery used this insular Latin. It is actually possible that St. Patrick, the Romano-British monk who brought Christianity to Ireland, probably spoke a bit of vernacular insular Latin. It was probably also used at Tintagel, in what is now southern Wales or so, or western south, somewhere in southwestern England. I think it's in South Wales. But anyways, at some point around the 8th century, Insular Latin went extinct. So if you're wondering why there is no Romance language in the British Isles, it's because it was never that widely used or distributed, and it only survived in part because of trade between Byzantium and Tintagel and Christian missionaries, and it eventually died out anyways because Britain was never that massively Romanized to begin with. But the Venerable Bede, Saint Bede in the 8th century, wrote that Latin was one of the main languages of the British Isles, along with British, English, Pictish, and Gaelic. So anyways, that was in 1 hour and 38 minutes and 35 seconds my presentation of life in Roman Britain, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I will go to chat. Interdimensional Lizard says, evening. Chauncey Fatsack says, bread and circus. All right, so I will see you later, and have a good day. Peace.